Hi, everyone, and welcome to Lecture 7 on Hippocratic Gynecology. Before I get started into the Hippocratic views today, I wanted to start with just a little bit of background information on the status of women in Greek society and how they were viewed. So, ancient Greece was very much a sort of patriarchal and, in many ways, a misogynistic culture. And that was reflected, among other places, in their myths and religion themselves. So, in Greek myth and tradition, women were often blamed for various kinds of evils and misfortunes that happened to human beings. One example is the Trojan War. The Trojan War was started when the Trojan Paris kidnapped the Greek Helen, who was the wife of a Greek king, Menelaus, and then Menelaus and the rest of the Greeks traveled to Troy to win her back, resulted in the deaths of a lot of Greeks. Now, despite the obvious role of the man in this situation, in the Greek literary tradition and in popular thinking, Helen was the one who was actually most commonly blamed for the Trojan War and all of the sort of deaths and tragedies that resulted from it. Another example is the very first woman that existed, Pandora, who was actually sent to men by Zeus as a form of punishment. So Pandora famously had a jar that contained a whole bunch of various kinds of evils, and she opened the jar and released those evils into the world. Relevant to our course, one of those evils was disease itself. So here you have this idea that women were introduced into the world literally as a kind of curse or punishment sent from the gods. So that gives you a little bit of sort of like the mindset of Greek society toward women. In terms of their role in society, women were supposed to stay inside the household. And they were supposed to stay in the roles of wife and mother. Those were taken to be the primary functions of women in Greek culture, especially Athenian culture. They were supposed to be wives and mothers. That was their socially defined value. And this was these were roles that they were supposed to play very much strictly inside the household. And I mean strictly in the sense that respectable Athenian women weren't even supposed to be seen out in public outside of their own homes. They were supposed to remain sort of isolated in the private sphere of the household, and they weren't even supposed to be known to people outside in town. So if I were if I had women relatives living in my home, for example, and men in town knew their names, just the fact that their names were known was considered sort of shameful for my family. So they were supposed to be anonymous and isolated inside the home. Even when male guests came over to the home, women were supposed to retreat to their private sort of women's side of the house and weren't supposed to even see guests within their own home. So it was very much kind of an isolated society, and their roles were very sort of strictly defined. Women were supposed to have certain kinds of virtues then, and were considered to be good women or virtuous women when they had qualities that were associated with being good wives and mothers. And for the Greeks, that meant, in the case of wives, being silent and obedient to their husbands, and in the case of mothers, being loving and affectionate toward their children. Girls were considered adults from the age of 14, which meant for the Greeks that at the age of 14, they were considered eligible for marriage and eligible to start bearing children. And girls had girls and women had very little sort of political, legal, or even personal autonomy. So girls were treated as essentially the property of their fathers when they were young. And then the marriage ceremony was essentially a kind of way of transferring the property that was the woman into the guardianship of her husband, who from that point on had control of her. And to make matters worse, there was often a huge age gap between girls and husbands or husbands and wives. So often Greek men would get married not until around the age of 30 to 35, whereas girls were married when they were young teens or as early as young teens. And so in many cases, you would have, a man marrying literally a child. This is a passage from the ancient playwright Euripides' play Medea, in which Medea gives a speech sort of lamenting the fate of what it's like to be a woman in Greek society. So that's worth reading, both this passage and the play as a whole, which is amazing. Okay, so let's look a little bit at Hippocratic gynecology. So the Hippocratics wrote many treatises devoted to or that were specifically addressing women's health and gynecology. And just a side note, the Greeks didn't recognize the distinction between biological sex and gender, and they had a very binary view of both. So they used the terms female and woman interchangeably. And so the language that I use today will reflect that sort of cultural assumption on their part. So here's a list of the treatises in the Hippocratic corpus that we've seen before. I've highlighted the ones here that are focused specifically on women's health. And, a lot of the gynecological views that we're going to look at today and that are out there in ancient Greece are really sort of interesting. They're very weird, but a lot of them are also, I think, just very disturbing. And in order to sort of understand the thinking behind them, I think it's really important to understand the way that those views were interacting with the sort of patriarchal and misogynistic culture that they were emanating from. So what we're going to find in what follows is that a lot of the gynecological views sort of are directly informed by these sort of sexist cultural assumptions about women and their bodies and what their supposed functions were socially. And at the same time, we'll see that the gynecology is used to sort of reinforce and justify and rationalize some of those sexist practices and the particular norms that were related to how women were supposed to act. So we'll see that sort of as a theme throughout some of today's lecture. So when it came to women's bodies, the Hippocratics thought of women as, in a lot of ways, a different sort of creature or a different sort of animal from men. I think it would be too strong. Well, it would definitely be too strong to say that they thought of them as a different species, but they thought that their bodies were sort of fundamentally different from men's bodies. Now, obviously, women's bodies had different reproductive organs from men's, but for the Hippocratics, the fact that they had different reproductive organs didn't just make their bodies different with respect to those organs and reproductive acts themselves. Rather, they thought that the entire economy of women's physiology was changed by the fact that they had different reproductive organs and by the roles that those organs and processes related to them played in women's physiology. So, because they thought that women's reproductive parts and processes had such a drastic change or effect on the economy of their bodies, their discussions of women's health focus almost entirely on menstruation and the organs and processes related to reproduction. So let's start with menstruation. So something important in the background here is that Hippocratics thought that women have excess blood in their bodies. So they have more blood in their bodies than they're supposed to, more blood in their bodies than men. And they think this is true for two main reasons. So first, when our stomach digests food, we've seen this in previous lectures, it converts the food into blood, which then provides nourishment for the body. The blood travels throughout the body and delivers nourishment to all our parts. And then we've seen that physical activity or exercise uses up that nourishment or blood. So blood provides nourishment to the body, activity and exercise use up the nourishment. Because women are comparatively inactive or relatively inactive, however, they're not able to use up all of the nourishment that they consume. So here already you can see some of the sort of cultural practices interacting with the gynecological view. Why are women inactive? Well, because they're isolated in the homes and aren't supposed to be out in public. So naturally, it's going to tend to be the case that men tend to be a lot more physically active than women because of the sort of social isolation that existed. So, because women are inactive, they just aren't using up all of the nourishment and blood that they take in the way that men can. So that's the first reason. The second reason is that women's flesh was thought of as being loose and flexible and spongy. And what this meant is that their bodies are able to soak up and hold more blood than men's bodies. So we'll return to this sponginess, but I think to understand what they mean by loose and spongy, it's helpful to know that for the Greeks, they thought of like lean muscular bodies as being sort of dry and inflexible and sort of not porous and spongy. And so men who in Greek society exercised, were supposed to engage in physical fitness, tended to have muscular bodies that were thought of then as sort of like tight and compact, whereas women who did not engage in the same kinds of physical activity tended to not have muscle, and so their flesh was thought to be loose and spongy. And so not only do they have more blood in their bodies because they're not using it up through activity, but their bodies are actually set up in such a way that it can like literally soak up and hold more blood than men's bodies can. So another important view in the background here is that the Hippocratics conceive of the woman's body as a network of vessels and channels that lead to the womb. So they think of the woman's bodies as consisting of like passageways all over the body that all sort of like lead back to her womb. And over the course of each menstrual cycle, the excess blood that is in the woman's body gradually travels through these vessels towards the womb and fills it up. So women have all this excess blood in their bodies. Their body is a series of channels or passageways leading to the womb, and over the course of the menstrual cycle, the excess blood sort of travels through those passages toward the womb. And so menstruation itself occurs when the blood that's gathered together in the womb drains out. So once the womb gets completely full of blood, that's the point at which menstruation occurs. So menstrual blood itself, on this view, is essentially a kind of excess humor that builds up in the woman's body and then is flushed out during the process of menstruation. So menstruation actually serves a really important purpose, because if the excess blood stayed in the woman's body and continued to build up and build up and build up, it would become toxic. And we'll come back to that point in just a few minutes. So here's a couple slides about how Hippocratic dramatically overestimated the amount or average amount of menstrual blood. Breast development. So Hippocratic also explained women's breast in relation to this idea that their bodies are supposedly more loose and flexible and spongy. So in both sexes, the breasts swell at puberty, the Hippocratics thought, but because men's skin is tighter and firmer, it keeps the breast or chest from swelling very significantly. However, because women have stretchier skin, it allows much greater swelling. The fact that, or the idea that women had supposedly stretchier skin, was also sort of used to explain why they are capable of pregnancy in a way that men are not, or it's correlated with that. Breast development was also used to justify the idea that women were more irrational than men. So here again, you have gynecological views used to rationalize or justify sexist cultural assumptions about women. So, as we've seen earlier in this semester in a couple different places, and as we'll talk about more in a few weeks, the Greeks understood that there's sort of a close connection between a lot of our emotional reactions and our heart rate. So when we become afraid, when we become enraged, when we feel panicked, our heart tends to beat faster. And so the idea is when the heart's beating faster, there's more blood in our chest area. That's the idea. And so the idea is that when there's more blood in our chest area, we become more emotional. Because women's chests are bigger, therefore, the Hippocratics think, their chest can hold more blood than men's chests can. And since having blood in your chest area makes you more emotional, it means that women are always prone to becoming more emotional than men, more easily than men, and with more intensity than men, and thus were thought to be less rational. A couple interesting notes about reproduction. One is just that to note that the Hippocratics thought that both women and men contribute semen to the reproductive process. So women have a kind of semen or seminal fluid that is secreted internally near the womb. But men also have, of course, semen that's contributed from the penis, and the two have to mix together in order to produce the embryo or fetus. Another kind of wild idea that the Hippocratics had relates to the process of ejaculation for men. So they thought that male semen is stored in the brain or has its source in the brain. And when a man ejaculates, the semen has to travel down from our head all the way to the penis. And the Hippocratics actually use this to explain the fact that men tend to have more facial and body hair than women do. The idea is that hair is kind of like a plant that grows out of our skin. And they recognize that in order to grow, plants need moisture and they need to be fertilized and they need seed. Well, the word for semen and seed is the same word in Greek. And so the idea is that as the semen's traveling down through our bodies, it's essentially acting as a seed for hair and fertilizing our skin and allowing this like crop to grow on our faces or bodies. So they use this sort of idea about semen originating in the head to explain this other sort of noted difference between men's and women's bodies. Okay, so when it comes to diseases, Greeks believed that women experienced different kinds of diseases than men. So most medicine was actually designed for men's bodies. That's one reason why we haven't really talked much about women so far this semester, because the medicine that we've been looking at is really like specifically medicine for men. Gynecology for the Hippocratics was a separate discipline. And again, as I mentioned, they thought women's bodies were fundamentally different. So gynecology isn't just like this little add-on to everything that we've learned. It's a completely separate way of practicing medicine, or at least a way of practicing medicine that had some very different assumptions about how diseases arise and how to cure them. So Hippocratics tended to treat women's diseases separately from men's, and they attributed most of them to the woman's reproductive organs and processes related to them. In particular, they tended to explain most women's diseases in relation to what was going on with menstruation and her womb. So often the Hippocratics thought that a woman's reproductive organs were involved in her illness, even if she had the same symptoms that a man had. And conversely, even when women were exposed to the same diseases as men, they were often assumed to experience different symptoms from men. So The Hippocratics thought women and men suffered from distinct kinds of diseases. However, they applied the same basic principles to both men and women. So the approaches are going to be, some of the particular remedies and diagnoses are going to be very different, but the underlying basic medical principles are the same for men and women. So in particular, women are composed of the four humors, just like men are, and Hippocratic still explain women's diseases in terms of the four humors. One important difference, though, was that women were all considered to be very warm and moist and dominated by blood. So they were thought to be especially sanguine, related to the sanguine temperament, and they were supposed to be dominated by the humor of blood. Menstruation was supposed to be an indication or sign that that was true. So we've seen in the Hippocratic ideas about regimen that if a man has a sanguine personality and is dominated by blood, he could keep himself healthy and kind of balance out the slight excess of blood in his temperament through a dry diet and by using up excess blood and nourishment through exercise. Women, though, of course, weren't supposed to exercise in the way that men were. They were supposed to be inactive. Women were recommended, in general, to have a dry diet that would counterbalance the excess sort of warmth and moisture of their blood. But the idea was that no matter how many dry foods they eat, or no matter what regimen they adhere to, even if they did exercise, there's no regimen strong enough to fully counteract the innate moistness and warmth of their bodies. So this brings us back to the role of menstruation. So women are by nature sanguine and have this excess of blood, and this brings us back now to the role of menstruation. Menstruation for the Hippocratics served as a woman's main line of defense against disease. Recall that on the Hippocratic view, excess blood accumulates in the woman's body over the course of the month, travels to the womb, and then is expelled through the process of menstruation. So what's going on their understanding is that by expelling blood, the woman's body is regularly purging toxins, impurities, and excess humor from her body. So menstruation for women was essentially a kind of natural built-in purgative process, not unlike the ones that Hippocratic doctors used on men. So recall that in the case of men, a lot of the Hippocratic procedures involve draining excess humors from the body. A lot of these practices or techniques weren't practiced on women by Hippocratic doctors nearly as frequently as they were on men, however, because women already had this supposedly built-in system for purging excess blood and excess humors from their bodies. So bloodletting was a way of removing excess blood from the man's bodies, and the idea was women have this kind of built-in biological advantage of a natural way of expelling these humors. So one reason why Hippocratic thought that men's health and understanding men's diseases was much more complicated than women's is because they didn't have this built-in organ for flushing out and built-in process for flushing out excess blood and excess humor. So because menstruation served this important goal in maintaining health and expelling disease and toxin from the body, the main mechanism for keeping women healthy for the Hippocratics was making sure that menstruation was occurring consistently and regularly and the way it was supposed to. And as you probably saw in your or noticed in your reading, they recommended two main methods for ensuring or promoting menstruation: sexual intercourse and childbirth. These were supposed to facilitate menstruating by, quote unquote, loosening the passageways that would facilitate the blood's expulsion. So here again, you have the gynecology interacting with social ideas and sort of sexist assumptions about women's function in society in that the two things that are supposed to maintain their health and promote their health correspond to their roles as wife and mother. So Hippocratic recommended regular sexual intercourse for married women, and this was also one of the reasons why they thought that girls should be married and become sexually active quite young, as soon as they reach 14, as soon as menstruation starts, or even before, because they thought that they needed to engage in sexual intercourse and ideally become pregnant, so that because the idea is that when they do those things, that promotes healthy and regular menstruation. So because they understood menstruation in this way, they assumed that issues with the woman's health were likely due to something going wrong with that process. Not always, but often that was like sort of the go-to explanation for them. So as you'll see at the end of the semester when we look at our case studies, Hippocratic doctors were obsessed with tracking various aspects of menstruation. So their notes on women patients often note like the frequency of menstruation, the quality of it, the color, the viscosity, the amount, all of these various things, because in general, as we've seen, they were very interested in paying attention to and recording what goes into and out of the body. And because menstruation had this extra special role in the case of women's health, they were like sort of obsessed with noting features of it. If a woman failed to menstruate, this was taken to cause not only all of the various or many of the various physical diseases and pains and discomforts that a woman might experience, but also psychological diseases. So the Hippocratics talk about things like loss of reason, depression, or even suicide. So in other words, when women, or especially young girls, were susceptible to sort of ordinary sort of emotional reactions of sadness or despair or depression, the Hippocratics would attribute even that to something going wrong with menstruation and their reproductive parts. And of course, it goes without saying that, young girls in Greek society had plenty of reasons to, be depressed and to have mental health issues. They were literal children who were, essentially transferred from their father's home to the home of a complete stranger, an older man who was becoming their husband. There was a lot of really intense sort of pressures and special stresses on young girls in Greek society. Hippocratic doctors also had various techniques and methods for inducing menstruation if it wasn't occurring properly, or what they thought was properly. Okay, one of the really distinctive and certainly one of the more memorable features of Hippocratic gynecology is the conception of the wandering womb. So they believed that the womb didn't always remain stationary within the woman's bodies the way that they thought other organs did. So we've seen that they thought of the woman's body as this sort of system of channels and passageways that lead to the womb. And the womb had the capacity for moving itself around. The womb was, in a sense, animal-like in certain respects. And one respect in which it was animal-like was that it could move through the passageways and channels of the woman's bodies. And when it did that, it could relocate to other parts of the bodies and even attach itself to other organs in the woman's bodies. This included not just the immediately sort of neighboring organs, but it could even travel as far away as the brain and attach itself to the brain. So when the woman was healthy, the womb stayed where it was supposed to be, stayed in its rightful place in her body. But when it wandered, it produced all kinds of disturbances to the woman's body that resulted in various kinds of ailments and diseases. And those ailments and diseases varied depending on where the womb was moving to and which organs were affected by it. So if the womb, relocated to the heart area and attached itself to the heart, then that might cause certain issues related to heartbeat. If it attached to the lungs, that might be the source of trouble with respiration, and so on. The womb was supposed to be kept anchored in place by pregnancy or by the moisture brought to it by sexual intercourse. So, the Hippocratics provide yet another justification for recommending pregnancy and intercourse to women for the sake of their health. So the idea is that when the woman becomes pregnant, the embryo or fetus acts as a kind of anchor that holds the womb where it's supposed to be. So again, you have gynecological views rationalizing sort of cultural norms and practices and ideas. So when things were going wrong with the womb and it was wandering around the woman's body, the main goal of Hippocratic treatment was to get it back to its proper place in the body. And that brings us to the practice of fumigation. So, in order to understand fumigation, you have to know that the womb, according to the Hippocratics, had its own sense of smell. So this is another way in which the womb was sort of animal-like for them. They thought of the vagina as being sort of like a sense organ like the nose. So like the nose, the nose is an organ through which smells and scents can travel, and then because of that, we can sort of detect them with our sense organs. And smell things. Similarly, they thought of the vagina as being sort of like a nose that scents could travel through to get to the womb, where they could then be detected by the womb's sense of smell. So fumigation was a method of getting the womb back to where it was supposed to be in the woman's body by appealing to its sense of smell. What doctors would do is place or burn strongly scented substances in two places on the woman's body or around the woman's body. First, under her nostrils, and second, under her genitalia. And so, depending on which direction the womb needed to move, they would use foul-smelling substances for her nose and sweet-smelling substances for her vagina, or vice versa. So the idea was that the foul smell would repel the womb, while the sweet smell would draw the womb toward it. So if, for example, the womb had traveled too high up in the woman's body and was like, say, in the chest area, then they would burn foul-smelling stuff by her nose and sweet-smelling stuff under her genitalia. And the idea is that the womb would be repelled away from the gross smelling stuff up here, and that would cause it to move back down to where it was supposed to be, toward the pleasant smells. So fumigation was this method of trying to coax the womb back into the direction where it was supposed to be, which would thereby, on the Hippocratic view, correct the cause of the woman's illness. And here's an example from your reading talking about this. So we've seen over the course of the semester that the Hippocratics had some really strange, misguided ideas about human bodies in general. They had a lot of very, very wrong ideas about medicine and how the body works and what kinds of methods and practices will help make it better. And what we've seen today is that was really kind of taken to the extreme in the case of women, or was true to the extreme in the case of women. And one thing you might be asking yourself at this point is, how could they have been so wrong about women's bodies? I mean, granted that they were wrong about men's bodies too, but how could they have been even wronger about women's bodies? And I think there's sort of two main reasons, a lot of reasons, but two reasons that are worth noting. One is, of course, just sort of the cultural assumptions that I have been talking about today. So, gynecology was very much interacting with and informed by ignorance and misconceptions and sexist assumptions about women and their proper role in society. So that's one thing that was exerting pressure towards certain kinds of wrong views. But the other thing is something more sort of mundane. At this point in history, in Greek history, it was considered sacrilegious and it was illegal to perform dissections of bodies. So doctors and scientists and physicians didn't have access to the inside of a cadaver, say. They couldn't explore the inner nature of the human body and explore physiology and biology through the process of dissection. However, the one way that they did sometimes gain insight into the body was through warfare. So men would sometimes, in the course of war, of course, be mortally wounded. They would have, spears or swords cut their bodies open. And so, despite the fact that dissection was illegal, people had some visual access into men's bodies through the practice of warfare and the wounds that resulted from it. By contrast, women, again, were supposed to stay inside the home. They certainly weren't supposed to be engaging in warfare. And so the opportunities for seeing inside a woman's body were sort of much more limited than in the case of men's. And that is presumably one of the additional factors that allowed the Hippocratics to be especially sort of speculative and sort of, imaginative, shall we say, when it came to guessing what the inside of the woman's body was like and how it worked. Okay, so this concludes our lecture on gynecology. This also concludes our unit on the Hippocratics. We'll be moving on to some new material next week, and I will see you then.